Hey everyone, welcome. My name is Marilyn Shannon, and this is the Breaking Free Show. And I am so happy to have you here today. Hope all of you are doing well, enjoying the summer. I think it's summer where most people are, but maybe not. Maybe you're somewhere, and I don't know where that is, and you're experiencing winter. Who knows? Because we broadcast all over the world. But we're so delighted that you're here and that you've chosen to spend your time with us. So thank you so very much for that time. We honor it and we do our very best each and every week to bring you something different, something interesting, something cool, something out of the box, something that you're going to take away from here and go, wow, that was really interesting. And we do that each and every week. So thank you for being here. So before we get started with our guest, I want to say hi to Amnon.
Hello, Marilyn. How are you?
I'm good. And you?
I'm fine.
Did you have a good
Hectic.
week? Hectic.
Hectic. Oh,
What's
it's been
hectic?
busy today.
Busy. Oh, okay.
But
Something
it's
good.
okay. It's good. It's
It's
good.
good.
It's
All
good
right, it's
busy.
good. I'm busy too. All right, so let me just tell you all to please feel free to call in anytime you like during the show. This is a personal open invitation. You don't have to wait for me to tell you again, but I will. Call in 919-518-9773 if you have a phone, or you can join us on Skype. It will be voice, not video, and that is to computers, that's plural, 2K voice. It's the number 2K voice, computers 2K voice, and you can come in on there. And then we also have a lovely chat, and you can join us there as well. Just put your name under our video, and you can put your nickname, and you can comment in there, ask questions, and we will monitor that. And please feel free to do that because we love engagement, and especially when things are curious. And today's show is curious, and it's a mystery. And so I came up with the idea this morning and I started posting on social media that it's the mystery of history. And that is what our show is about today. So I'm going to ask my guest to join us. That is Andrew Lawler, and he's written the book, The Secret Token, Myth, Obsession, and the Search for the Lost Colony of Roanoke. Here you go. Here's his book. It is a cool looking book. So, Andrew, welcome.
Marilyn, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us today. So tell our viewers, our listeners, who are you?
Well, I'm a science writer, and I've written about science and archaeology for several decades. And I've been a writer for Science Magazine, Archaeology Magazine. I've written for National Geographic, as well as for Smithsonian. And a few years ago, I stumbled onto this particular story that I have a lot of personal interest in, and ended up writing a book. And that's what you just held up for everybody to see.
So you started your interest in this started bubbling. When was that?
Well, probably when I was about 4 or 5 years old. When I was a kid, I grew up in Southern Virginia, and we would go down to the Outer Banks of North Carolina, not too far from where you are,
Right.
and we would go see an outdoor drama called The Lost Colony. It was a play that commemorated the first English attempt to settle the New World. And from an early age, it was very much part of our family story, our family myth. And of course, the big mystery is what happened to these people when in 1587 their governor left to go to England. And when he got back with supplies and help, they had vanished. So as a child, this always intrigued me. What happened to these 115 men, women, and children who simply vanished off the coast of North Carolina?
So this book took you how long to write?
Well, about 3 years ago, I came across an Indian. I was in an Indian restaurant in England, and I came across an English archaeologist. And I asked him where he was digging, and he told me that he was digging on a place called Hatteras Island. And I said, "But Hatteras? You mean on the coast of North Carolina?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, did you find the lost colony?" And he said, "Well, as a matter of fact, we did." And I asked him that because I knew that Croatoan is today called Hatteras, and that was one of the clues as to where the colonists had gone. And strangely enough, archaeologists had never actually done excavations, done actual digging to see if, in fact, the colonists went there and perhaps left behind physical evidence. So he was busy trying to find that physical evidence, and that started my journey.
So did you start to team up with him then?
Well, I'm a journalist, so I did go to visit him at his site. It took me a year to convince him that I was a person to come and report on what he was discovering there. And also, I discovered there was a second dig that was occurring about 50 miles from there by a second independent team that was also looking for physical evidence for what happened to the lost colonists. So, in short, this had been a story, a 400-year-old mystery that historians had been unable to solve because there simply weren't any more clues. We had the documents, but no new documents had surfaced. But we now have the ability to use archaeology to be able to determine actual physical evidence, physical clues to what took place there.
So do you think you discovered what happened?
Oh, well, that's a question that has a longer answer than you may want.
I want the whole answer. I want it all.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think we have to go back to the beginning. Let's give people who are watching a sense of what it is we're talking about here. And just a really brief overview. So in the 1580s, England was a pretty poor and backward country. And Spain and Portugal and France were busy carving up the New World and getting very wealthy by doing so. But the English were behind. They didn't have the ability to make maps. They didn't have good sea captains. They didn't have good ships. They really were on the fringe of Europe. There was nothing that said the English had to settle North America and create the basis for what became the United States. In fact, it's quite possible that never would have happened had it not been for Roanoke. So in the 1580s, there was a move by Sir Walter Raleigh and other courtiers in Queen Elizabeth's court to try and pull together the resources and the expertise necessary to settle the New World. And to do that, they hired people, including Portuguese and Jews from Prague and others, to try and do what the English themselves were incapable of doing. That is, to actually carry out the complex effort to create a base on another continent. Should I go on?
Yo, keep going. And I'll tell you what, I'll make a deal with you.
Yeah.
I will interrupt you as soon as I have to, but right now I just want all the fascination. I want you to keep on going.
Okay, so I'll just give that quick skip. 1584 was the first voyage. So in 1584, two ships left England, and they arrived off the coast of North Carolina. There they did a reconnaissance, basically like NASA does when it visits a new planet. You send people to kind of scope it out. So these people scoped it out for 6 weeks, went back to England. The report was good. The Indians were friendly. There were potential resources there, a potential shortcut to Asia, because they actually believed that the sounds of North Carolina might actually lead to the Pacific Ocean, which is a misguided notion, but it certainly made it an interesting spot for them to try and settle. So in 1585, the following year, Sir Walter Raleigh got together investors, and he was able to pull together a very large fleet with maybe up to 700 people to try and move to the East Coast, get them over to the East Coast of North America, and create a stable colony that could produce revenue for England. And now the revenue by doing all kinds of things like trying to find resources like metals, selling cloth to the natives, trying to buy deer skins and other animal hides, and also pirating. This was an important piece of what the English wanted to do, because the Spanish ships that came from the Caribbean all sailed past the Outer Banks on their way to Spain. So it was also a great place to build a pirate base, because you could dart out into the ocean, snag a Spanish ship, and then come back and resupply. So there were a lot of reasons for the English to settle on the Outer Banks. So in 1585, the ships arrive. 100 men are finally left behind to create the first permanent settlement by the English in the New World. And at first, things actually went pretty well. It looked as if the relationship with the natives would be fine. Both sides were eager to trade with one another. They both had things that the other wanted. But within a matter of 6 months, things began to go sour. The English didn't have the ability to feed themselves. And if they couldn't feed themselves, they had to depend on the Native Americans, who had limited resources, who only had so much corn to sell or trade. So in the end, there was conflict. And this happened over and over and over again in later English settlements. So finally, the English, hearing a rumor that the Indians were about to attack, they decided to take that first step, and they actually attacked an Indian village across the water from their settlement on Roanoke Island, killing the Indian chief, which is a really bad idea to kill your host.
Right.
And as a result, at that point, they had lost all their support among Native Americans. They were hungry. Their clothes were ragged. They were really in desperate circumstances. And fortunately for them, at that moment, a fleet that was captained by Sir Francis Drake, a famous pirate of that era, happened to come by the Outer Banks, and they hopped on the ship, went back to England, and that basically was the end of the first colony. It was all male, by the way, and they all got back safely to England. So at that point, it should have been the end of the Roanoke voyages. In other words, Walter Raleigh said, look, I'm tapped out. I've spent a lot of money. I've got no return. War with Spain is brewing. He decided to focus his efforts on building a colony in Ireland, much closer, much cheaper. But the artist on this first voyage, this first settlement, John White, he was a court painter. He and some friends got together and went to Raleigh and said, look, don't give up. Give us one more chance. We really think that this will benefit us and England and you if we establish a base in the New World. So Raleigh said, okay, but I'm not putting up the money. And they said, that's fine. What we'll do is we'll create this thing called a corporation, which was a completely brand new idea in that era. And the idea was that you get money from individuals who all get a share in the company. And in exchange, people got to then travel to the New World for free. And they also got 500 acres of land when they arrived. A huge king's ransom in terms of English farmers of the day. So John White and his friends managed to convince 115 men, women, and children that they should get on a ship, leave their comfortable lives, mostly in London. They were mostly Londoners, mostly shopkeepers, policemen. There was a college professor, a sheriff. So they get on this ship and they sail over to Roanoke Island where they settle. Of course, the Native Americans aren't happy to see them. They're still angry about what happened previously, the massacre that took place. So one of the colonists immediately is killed, and the situation is very grim. So John White, who has now been made the governor by Raleigh to lead this group, goes back to England in order to get supplies and additional people, because he knows they need a critical mass to survive. He was supposed to be back in 6 months. And when he leaves, he left not just the colonists, but his own daughter, Eleanor Dare, as well as his granddaughter, Virginia Dare, who had just been born a few days before he left to return to England. But fate intervened. War with Spain suddenly blew up. The Spanish sent an armada against England. War was on. And the colony in Roanoke was essentially forgotten. But not by John White, who of course has family as well as the people he's responsible for across the ocean. So he manages over and over again to get on a ship, but he can never get back to the New World. It's not until 1590, that's 3 years later, and it's actually on Virginia Dare's third birthday, that he steps foot again on Roanoke Island. And by the time he gets there, they're gone.
You know, it's interesting because these names are, being in North Carolina, of course, I'm not from North Carolina, but being in North Carolina, I've heard these names, so many times, but I've never really heard the story. So
Right.
he comes back and they're gone. Now, is this where you pick up?
Well, so there were some clues. And the main clue, which probably many of your viewers, particularly those in North Carolina, will know, is that when he returned and is poking around in the settlement, there are some things that he sees and doesn't see. He sees no sign of a massacre. He sees no sign of graves or bones or destruction. Everything looks peaceful. But he does find a carving on a post, and the carving says Croatoan. Now, this is not some magical mystery word. It was a word that John White knew quite well. This is a word that meant what we call today Hatteras Island. It was also the name of the Indians who lived in that area at that time, who had still remained allied to the English. So for John White, this was great news. So the settlers had left, apparently in an orderly fashion. They'd gone to this island 50 miles to the south to live with the friendly Native Americans. Of course, his next step was to try and get there in order to find them. So he returns to the ship from Roanoke Island, and the next morning they're trying to get to the south, but a big storm blows up. They lose an anchor because John White has very bad luck. And in the end, he is forced to go back to England and is never able to return. And that is kind of the end of the history, the part that we know for sure, because John White wrote an account of his 1590 voyage. But after that, there's very little information. There's some rumors at Jamestown, which happened 20 years later, the first permanent settlement, that some of the colonists might still be alive and living with the Indians to the south. But nobody actually makes an expedition south that we know of and finds hard evidence that the colonists actually are still alive. And of course, that was 20 years later.
So Andrew, so I'm not up with the history. So what you're saying is no one actually found where they went. It's all been just clues or hearsay or mystery or just, but nobody's actually discovered where they actually went. Okay, so he'll be back, I'm sure. And I will ask him that question when he comes back. But don't you find this fascinating? And what I love so much is how, is he back? Okay, Andrew, you back?
Yes. Can you see me now?
Yes, we can see you. Yeah, we had a little glitch, but technology glitches.
Right.
So are you saying, and I was just kind of reiterating to our audience, so are you saying then that throughout all of these years, nobody actually discovered where they went?
That is correct. There were lots of theories.
Many
theories. There was a theory, of course, they did go to Croatoan, because that's where they said they were going to go. And that's actually the secret token referenced in my title.
Okay.
That John White had said, look, if you go anywhere while I'm gone, leave a note. And they did. They left a note. They said, we're going to Croatoan. But there are other theories, too. They might have gone 50 miles inland, because John White makes this peculiar reference to the colonists planning to move 50 miles into the Main or into the mainland.
Mm-hmm. So, Andrew, let me ask you a question. How come with all of these clues, he doesn't. Andrew, how come
about the connection, but let's go ahead.
How come with all these you didn't buy it, these clues, that you felt there was more?
Yes. What I discovered was that, interestingly enough, most Americans actually forgot about the lost colonists for about 250 years. So for 250 years, there simply was very little interest in figuring out what happened to the colonists. It was only in the 1830s that people became interested in the lost colony again.
And so what was it about all of those clues that you didn't buy, that you felt there was more to the story?
Well, I was not convinced by the archaeology. When I went to these sites and visited them, we would solve this mystery. The archaeologists would come up with physical clues, and we roll mystery in a matter of a few weeks, a few dig seasons. But the more I looked at the physical evidence that the archaeologists were actually finding, the more I realized that they hadn't really nailed it. So I'll give you an example. At the site at Hatteras, Croatoan, where this English archaeologist was digging, they found all kinds of interesting objects. For example, they found the hilt of an Elizabethan dress sword. And this was in a Native American village. They also found evidence that these Native Americans were making bullets, a technology that the Native Americans themselves did not have until much later. There were also other bits and pieces of English artifacts, which seemed to indicate that the lost colonists had in fact moved to Croatoan, as John White suspected. However, when you actually looked at the data these archaeologists uncovered, it turned out that the material they found dated to the late 17th century, so almost 100 years after the lost colony. So a lot of what they found could be explained as material that had been traded later from Jamestown to the north. So I wasn't convinced that it was as simple to say that we found some pots that looked like they're English, therefore the lost colonists went there. So halfway through my project, I realized that the science wasn't really going to give us a definitive answer. But the science was telling us something new. And that was that Native Americans and the English, whether they were lost colonists or English who arrived, say, 50, 60 years later, were living very, very closely with the Native Americans. And that came as a big surprise.
Why was that a surprise?
Well, because we've always been taught, and historians had always assumed, that when the English arrived in the New World, they built their own settlements and they kept their distance from these people that they considered savage and dangerous, and certainly heretics who weren't good Christians. So the idea was that the English came and they built their own little sustainable communities, which grew into the 13 colonies and created the country that we know. But the archaeology is showing very clearly that Native Americans and the English were living very closely together, that they were trading not just objects, they were trading technology, and they were living virtually cheek by jowl. And that is not something that's in the history books. That's something that archaeologists only in the past few decades have begun to realize. And the reason that matters is because if that's true, then doesn't it seem obvious that the lost colonists assimilated with the Native Americans? I mean, let me ask you a question, Marilyn.
Mm-hmm.
If your refrigerator is empty and your car is out of gas, do you sit in your house and starve? Or would you go over to your neighbor's house and say, hey, could I trade this painting for a meal? Or could I cut your grass in exchange for some food? I mean, wouldn't you make that choice?
Yeah.
Right. So historians now and archaeologists now pretty much agree that the lost colonists, if they survived, then almost certainly they would have assimilated with the Indians. So if that's the case, then why do we call it the lost colony?
That was my question.
Right. And when I asked this obvious question, I just asked historians, I said, so when did people start calling it the lost colony? And to my surprise, nobody could give me an answer. Finally, I found a professor at East Carolina University who said, I think it was the 1830s. So I began to explore the history of the history. And what I discovered was that the lost colonists were actually lost in the 19th century. What I mean by that is that people didn't think of it as a mystery until the 19th century. And when I started to piece together what was happening in the 1830s, I realized that there was more to this than simply a romantic tale that attracted people. It was actually inevitable that people began to talk about the colonists as lost. Because if they were assimilated with the Indians, that would mean that white people and Indians had married. And in that day and age, in the 1830s, that was not okay. That was actually something that was illegal and very, very taboo.
And John White's family assimilating. So what have you discovered? Like, what other little things have you discovered in this story that have been intriguing to you?
Well, the most intriguing, I think, was when I began to look into the oral histories of people in eastern North Carolina. Now, there are lots and lots of stories of the ways in which the lost colonists assimilated. You find among the Lumbee Indians, for example, in eastern North Carolina, lots of traditions where people talk about having taken in the lost colonists. You also find a lot of families in the eastern part of the state who have stories about being related or descended from the lost colonists. And I was curious about those. Now, we don't have much in the way of documentation, but when I started to examine what happened to the Croatoan Indians, remember, these are the Indians who lived on Croatoan Island, which is now called Hatteras, I discovered that they had moved in the 17th century, so a century or so after the lost colonists, over to the mainland. And they were living deep in these swamps. And they moved there because the English were coming back in, a second wave of English, They were creating tobacco farms. They were bringing in enslaved Africans, and the Indians were trying to get away from these people. And by settling in the swamps, it became a kind of refuge. And then I learned that enslaved Africans were escaping from plantations and moving into these areas. And also, there were some whites who also would leave kind of mainstream society and move into these swampy areas to get away from the government. So what was happening was these multiracial communities began to form. And this is something I really had no knowledge of, even though I grew up in that area, that there were these blacks, whites, and Indians who over the centuries mixed together and created their own unique societies. So that to me was completely fascinating because that was a history that was never told and never talked about. So if you think about it, if the colonists did in fact assimilate with the Croatoans or other Indians in that area, and they ended up then in these refuges of, say, a century or so later, then what would those people have been in the 19th century? Well, those people by the 19th century would have been classified under state law as colored, that is, as African American, or really a combination of mulatto and black and people who were Indian as well. So what I realized was that ironically, that the colonists, their most likely descendants, if they still exist, would in fact today be African American.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And what do you think the English taught? Why, first of all, why did they leave the colony?
Why
do you think that the inhabitants of that colony actually leave?
You mean why did the lost colonists
Yes.
leave Roanoke Island?
Yes.
Well, that's a question we can't answer fully, in part because we don't even know where the settlement was on Roanoke Island. Despite a century of excavations, archaeologists still don't know the place where the lost colonists left from, which could provide clues as to why they left. Now, what happened to the settlement? And this was a large settlement. Probably there were a total of 250 people who lived there over the course of 3 or even 4 years. So there should be a lot of archaeological material there for archaeologists to find, which could give us clues. But as of last year, there don't seem to be any clear answers to what happened. It's possible that there was erosion on the shore of Roanoke Island, and that erosion washed away what's left of that first English settlement in the United States. Or it could be that that it's simply in a place that they haven't found yet, they haven't looked for yet. So there are a lot of questions that are so basic that we have yet to answer, such as where the colonists left from. But it seems pretty clear that they probably had to leave Roanoke because A, there were enemies nearby, or B, they needed a place where they could plant some good corn, and they needed a place with better soil and maybe a little bit healthier. Roanoke Island's pretty swampy. It's not an ideal place to have a farm. It's a wooded area now, but it's not really an ideal place to develop a thriving colony.
So through your work with the Lost Colony, has that led you to something for your next book?
Oh, well, I have no doubt that I'll be writing more stories about what's going on with the Lost Colony. I mean, there's still archaeology digs underway. The folks that are working 50 miles west of Roanoke Island that have been digging there at a place called Site X intend to resume digging. I'm excited to see what they find. And actually, let me tell you about that site because it's really fascinating. In 2012, for the first time, a new clue emerged. There was a map of eastern North Carolina that was drawn by John White, the artist I mentioned. And on that map was a patch located what looks to be about 50 miles west of Roanoke Island.
Can I interrupt you a second? Is that one of the pictures you sent us?
Possibly.
Okay, let's put up some of these pictures and then let's see if we can actually see it, because I think it's one of the pictures and I think it would be really timely. Okay, so once again, here's the cover for this really interesting book.
Yes.
Okay.
So this is a map that was drawn by John White in 1585. And if you see, there's a little island there that is kind of midway down between the Outer Banks and the mainland. That's Roanoke Island. So that's where the colonists initially settled. And if you look just due south of there, in kind of in pink, there's a little island below. That's Croatoan Island. And then if you look just to your left, go down that body of water that goes to the left, that's Albemarle Sound. And if you look right where those two rivers break apart, you see like a little area that looks like a little round patch. I don't know if you have a close-up image of that.
Can you do it? Because Amnon will try. Andrew, how did you find this map?
Well, this is a map that's in the British Museum.
Okay.
This is one of the prizes of the British Museum. It's one of a series of watercolors that John White, the artist and later the governor, there we go, that's great, the governor of the colony, created with the help of Thomas Harriot. Thomas Harriot was a very famous scientist and mathematician who was an incredible map maker, and he was able to chart this area in a way that was remarkably accurate. This is the most accurate map of eastern North Carolina that was done for the next 200 years. So if your viewers can look to the left, top left, you'll see that like little patch area where those two rivers break apart. Now that has been there for 400 years. Nobody had asked the question, what's under the patch? Now I don't know if you have another image. Do you have any other images?
Let's see. I think there's some.
Well, we can stop there.
Okay.
So under that patch, what the researchers found, so it was actually a UNC Chapel Hill professor who noticed the patch and said, what's under it? And this is 2012. The British Museum people finally put it on a light table. And when they looked under the patch, they could see there was the image of a fort. Now, what was so astonishing about this was that John White himself had written that the colonists intended to move 50 miles into the Main. Interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here's a patch covering a fort that is 50 miles into the Main. So this got archaeologists very excited. So what they did was they began to dig in that general vicinity. And just to talk about this painting that is in front of your viewers now, this is just a fantastic view of the way the Carolina Algonquins fished and kind of the seafood that was their daily fare. You can see the hand-hewn canoe that they're paddling. There's a fire in the boat. Probably they're fishing at night, and that was a way to attract fish by having a little fire going nearby that would pull fish in. So this is just an example of John White's really magnificent vision of what it was like in the 1580s on the coast of North Carolina. These are the only images that we have of these Carolina Algonquins.
So Andrew, before we go further, I want to. Here we go. Yeah, talk about this, and I want to know more about that fort.
Yeah, so if you see, your viewers now can see, this is an image that was taken by the British Museum when they put this 1585 map drawn by John White onto a light table. And you can see clearly that underneath the patch is this four-sided fort. Now, this is a clue that no one knew was there. And what's even more interesting about this clue is that, although you can't see it, I don't think I sent you the UV version, but on top of that patch, analysts noted there was some substance. And when they analyzed it, they discovered that there was another image of a fort on top of the patch that was drawn with urine. Why urine? Urine is a kind of invisible ink that's commonly used in prisons and elsewhere to send messages. So clearly, John White, and we know from analysis that the paints that were used were the same era as John White. So John White drew this fort originally, and then he covered it over. And then he drew, or someone close to him, drew an image of a fort with invisible ink. Now, this just gets stranger and stranger. So the question, of course, is what does it mean? Well, you could say if the patch was just covering up a fort that never got built, it was a real estate development that didn't happen, then it was just a mistake and he was correcting for it. But the fact that there's invisible ink on top of it shows that, in fact, there must have been something there that they were trying to hide. Hide from whom? Well, the people they really worried about in those days were the Spanish. Spain was the most important and wealthiest empire in the world, and they claimed all of North America for their own. They were very worried about the English having a pirate base located on the Outer Banks that could attack Spanish ships. So Spain spent a lot of time and money and effort trying to figure out where these English were exactly and trying to snuff out this colony. So to have a map that shows where the colonists are would have been extremely dangerous. So clearly John White was trying to hide this, presumably from the Spanish. And so this being the first real clue in 400 years, it gave archaeologists a chance to dig at the spot. Now, the trouble is, this is not a tiny spot. This isn't a GPS coordinate. That fort that you see there covers thousands and thousands of acres of land. It's not a precise location. So in 2012, archaeologists set out to see if they could pinpoint a place where the English settled after 1587. And at a site that they called Site X, the archaeologists began to dig because they knew there was an important Native American village at the juncture of these two rivers, the Chowan and the Roanoke rivers. And they thought, oh, this looks like a natural spot. If the English were going to be anywhere, you see if you see that ship there to the right, it's really clear that if you're sitting at that point, what is now Bertie County, you look right down the Albemarle. So if you've got enemies coming after you, particularly Spanish ships that are coming to destroy your colony, this is a very strategic point to sit at because you can see exactly who's coming up the sound, coming up that large body of water. So the archaeologists, indeed, once they've been digging, they did find, to their amazement, English pottery in a Native American settlement. And why that is important is because people tend to use their own pottery. The Indians were probably unlikely to say, take pottery from Roanoke Island and bring it all the way up the Sound. They had their own pottery. They didn't need English pottery. So it's quite likely that that pottery was actually used by the English people who made it, or that they were.
This is really fascinating. I find this so fascinating because reality, it's so surreal, and because of technology, you're able to put some more of this together. It's fascinating. I wanted to ask you just really quickly, the play, The Lost Colony, how accurate, not accurate, what has that done for all of this?
Well, I went to that play, as I mentioned, I think every year as a child for at least 15 seasons, and I knew it inside and out. And as I got older, I thought it was sentimental. I thought it was melodramatic. But as I began to learn more about the playwright, Paul Green, I realized there's something else going on with that play that's very important. And what's important is that Paul Green took the story of the Lost Colony, which had been really a story about the romance of Virginia Dare, this imagined, this child who was imagined to have grown up to be a woman living in the woods with the Indians, a very popular legend in the 19th century. And Paul Green completely ignored a whole century of stories and legends which were built up around Virginia Dare. And instead, he actually focused his play on the history. So he took it bit by bit, starting with the 1584 voyage, moving to 1585, and then the Lost Colony of 1587. And in the end, to his credit, they march off into the woods, but he doesn't make a clear statement as to what actually happened, because he was a good dramatist, and he understood that you don't really want to reveal too much, because nobody knew what happened to them. So he left it as a mystery. He left the play as something that kind of fed the imagination. But he did do a great service in turning the story from pure legend, that is Virginia Dare, who we don't know if she lived beyond the week after she was born, to the real history and the real excitement behind the entire Roanoke voyages.
And who was John White's wife?
John White's wife did not travel. We don't have her name, I believe. She did not travel with him, but Eleanor Dare, his daughter, did. And Eleanor Dare, by the way, left a young child in England when she went to the New World. Virginia Dare was not her first child. She had at least one other child who was left in London while she got on a ship when she was several months pregnant to go to the New World. But we don't know much about John White's family.
Oh, I guess maybe, did I misunderstand you when you were saying that he left his daughters behind? Oh, in England or at the Lost Colony?
No, John White left his daughter Eleanor Dare and son-in-law Ananias Dare on Roanoke Island when he left in 1587 to return to England for supply.
All right, I got it. Okay, cool.
And they had Virginia Dare had been born on Roanoke Island, the first English child born in the New World.
Okay, all right, I got it. All right, now I'm going to go back to the PowerPoints because I don't want us. They're really juicy. Okay, so what is this one?
This is actually a site on Roanoke Island itself. This is an attempt by archaeologists to try and discover more about where the lost colonists left from. This is a little tiny piece of pottery that was found there in that trench about a year ago. And, you know, Roanoke Island has been so dug through and so little has been found that this actually counted as a major find. It was a piece of what is clearly 16th century pottery that has been finally unearthed after 400 years. It's not much, but it definitely shows that the English at least were there.
And who funds these digs?
Well, this particular dig was the First Colony Foundation. It's a nonprofit organization based in Durham, actually, that has been working for a number of years to try and uncover evidence of the settlement on Roanoke Island. Also, they are the same foundation that dug at Site X.
Okay. All right, this next one?
Oh, that's my friend Charlie Gouch, who is an archaeologist who was digging at Cape Creek. That is the site on Croatoan Island. And it's a great picture. It gives you a sense of the difficulty of doing archaeology on a barrier island that is full of just mud and sand. So that was a common experience at the end of the day. They definitely had to get in the showers. But they're picking through all kinds of not just artifacts, they're also looking at bones, really trying to gather everything they could to analyze and see if it could provide more information as to not just what happened to the colonists, but how Native Americans and the English were living together in this era.
Andrew, it appears to me there's so much to discover in this whole myth, in this whole story, and all this history. It's endless. It's endless.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there were so many little kind of blind alleys that I had to go down, and as well as those that seemed like blind alleys but led to something new. I mean, for example, there was a ring that was found at that site that you just saw where Charlie is standing in the mud. It was a small ring that had a heraldic symbol. It had a lion on it, clearly European and probably Elizabethan. This is a spectacular find that was made because very few artifacts like that had been uncovered on the Outer Banks. And the archaeologist at the time, this is an earlier dig in the 90s, he took that ring to a jeweler in Nag's Head and said, "Could you analyze this?" And in the report, the archaeologist's report, he said, "Well, the jeweler said that it's 14 karat gold." And the archaeologist said, clearly it's Elizabethan, and it was for a long time thought to be clear evidence that Roanoke voyagers had lived on Croatoan, or at least spent time there or had dropped their ring there. But when I went to London to talk with the people who actually give out, the heralds who actually give out coats of arms, they were skeptical. They said, this line is a very common form of heraldry, doesn't look like it's very specific, and the quality of the ring is really poor. Are you sure it's gold? And I thought, well, it was in the archaeology report. And the herald said to me, you ought to check. So I called up ECU, East Carolina University, which still has the ring in its vault. And I asked, have y'all analyzed the ring? And no one had. So I talked with Charles Ewan, who is an archaeologist at ECU, who said he would be delighted to use what's called an XRF machine that can determine the composition of the ring. So I went down there with a National Geographic photographer, and we watched as Charlie pulled out the ring and the technician set it on what looked like kind of a hair dryer, and the hair dryer basically sends waves through the ring, and you could actually tell what the specific composition of it of the material was. And the guy said, "It's all copper. It's brass. This is not a gold ring." So what I learned was that these myths that spring up around the lost colony, they're like mushrooms. There's always a new one. And so I went through and I tried to examine all the evidence I could and get as much scientific analysis done as possible to see what's really solid and what is just myth and legend that people like their myths, and that's great. But that's just an example of one of the roads I went down.
It's fascinating. You're really quite the detective. I mean, you can't be satisfied with anything that you find. You have to just keep digging and digging and digging.
Well, that's part of being a journalist. As you you have to keep asking the right questions. So what really turned the story for me was asking that question: who came up with this idea of the lost colony? And that led me down this path of discovering that the whole idea of the lost colony was wrapped up with ideas of immigration and race in the 19th century, and that Virginia Dare actually became a very important symbol of white supremacy in the early 20th century. And for some people, she still is. Now, that was a complete surprise, and I only stumbled on that because I asked that one simple question: who came up with the idea of the lost colony?
Very interesting. So tell everybody. I mean, we still have some time, but I want you to do some book marketing.
Right. Well, right now I'm on a whirlwind book tour. I started at June 5th on the launch at Malaprops in Asheville, where I live, and I've been traveling around the South. Now I'm in New Jersey, heading up to New England for the next few days, and then on July 5th, I'll be in Norfolk, Virginia, my hometown. I'll give a talk there, and from there, I'll spend the next week moving my way down the Outer Banks. I'll be speaking at Southern Shores. I'll be at Manteo. I'm going to go down to Hatteras, of course, and Ocracoke Island before moving on to Southern Pines. If you want to look at my events, www.andrewlawler.com. The events tab has all the places I'll be. And I'm visiting only independent bookstores, trying to really support that part of the community, and having some really great conversations with people about not just the mystery of the lost colony, but also about race and immigration and what this history really says about who we are as Americans. And I think that's a really rich debate to be having at this point in our history.
Absolutely. So that I'm glad you brought that up because I want to go there. So, I mean, I know we don't have hours and hours to talk about it. I wish we did. So, based on your findings and based on today's what we're dealing with today, so what is it? What is it telling us? What you've discovered and where it's leading? What is it telling us?
Well, I think it has a surprisingly relevant message. I mean, I started just pursuing what seemed like an old mystery that might be answered by science, by archaeology. And I came out on the other side with a completely different way of seeing this country and this country's early history. I think that all of the elements that created our country, in other words, our national DNA, came together on Roanoke Island. It was a place where the English first encountered Native Americans. It was a place where enslaved Africans possibly were brought by Sir Francis Drake in 1586. So they may have been actors in this drama at the very beginning. So, if you have Native Americans and whites and Africans there in this one spot at the very beginning, then I think it speaks to the melting pot that this country has been, not just since the 1890s or Ellis Island, but from the very start, from the very beginning. We weren't a country of just one kind of person. We were a country that mixed. And finding these people who still exist in large numbers in eastern North Carolina, and the Lumbee Indians as well, who are really mixed populations, whose history has been wiped out because of the history in this country of racism, was really stunning to me. So it actually gave me a lot of hope, because I could see for the first time clearly that we're not a country that ultimately has succeeded in trying to keep people apart, that inevitably we merge, we take our food, our language, our traditions, and we create something new as Americans. And to me, that was not a message that I expected to get by trying to
Right.
dig into the story of what happened to some dead Elizabethans.
You never know. Let me ask you something. Have there been a DNA study with any of the I mean, is there any way of doing any DNA studies to see on any of the Indian population in North Carolina or anything?
Well, it's a good question. So there are two questions there. One is, could you use DNA to actually find descendants of the lost colonists? It's an intriguing question, but I quickly realized when I started talking to biologists that it's not as easy as it sounds. And that's because you need two things. First, you need a skeleton. You have to have a skeleton from somebody who's a lost colonist. And so far, nothing has been found that could be clearly identified as belonging to a lost colonist. And for that to be done, preferably you would look for a woman whose head is facing east and her body is stretched out in a straight line. Why that? Well, because if it's a woman, probably it's somebody from the 1587 colony, the only colony where there were women, and also facing east because that's the way Christians at that time buried themselves. So that would be a really good clue.
Wow.
Yet.
Wow. Andrew.
Even if you have that woman whose head is facing east, you still have to compare it with something. So you've got to have a living descendant of the lost colony. You have to have them preferably in England, where the population hasn't changed a lot in the past few centuries. But if you've looked in any Elizabethan phone books lately, you know that there are a lot of John Whites, there are a lot of common names. It's extremely hard. In fact, it's proved so far impossible to find a particular descendant of the lost colony. Because if you had that, you can compare that with the skeleton and then maybe match. And that could tell you, great, this is where a lost colonist went. But we don't have the data on either end at this point.
So I'm not just asked a really good question. Are there no people in England that can claim to be descendants of the lost colony? Of the people yeah.
Well, there are plenty of people who might claim it, but there's no genealogical evidence that can trace a clear line from 1580 all the way to today. That is just difficult. Records have been lost, names change. It's just, and the names were so common back then, and there's so few of them, that the name Barry, for example, is tossed around as, possibly there's somebody in Western England named Barry. But to actually make the connection has proved extremely difficult. And again, without that skeleton, without that DNA, ancient DNA from the bones of somebody on that coast of North Carolina, that won't give you any new data. Now, that said, DNA is really useful for looking at these mixed populations in eastern North Carolina. And clearly, we're talking about people who have a lot of African American, a lot of European American, and some Native American. A lot of the Native American genes have been washed out over time. Just the sheer numbers of people who came from Africa and Europe have made that signal, if you will, that genetic signal very low. But that doesn't mean that people don't have Native American heritage. It just means that there was so much mixing that happened after that it's hard to really isolate that. So there are ways that we can use DNA to really see, and I think most of your viewers, if they've done 23andMe or the National Geographic DNA project that's underway, they know that nothing's pure. Everybody's a mix. It's just a matter of what proportion it is.
Interesting. Yeah, and who they think they are, and then they come to find out that they're not exactly who they think they are based on their DNA.
Right. For example, I met a woman who grew up on Roanoke Island, who is raised as African American, but is now reclaiming her heritage as a Native American. She says, "I'm a mix. I'm all three. I'm Native American. I'm white, and I'm African American." And I think this is kind of the way forward, that we acknowledge different parts of us, and by doing that, we can recover some of this history.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And so let me hold up the book again, and everybody can get it where?
Go to your independent bookstore, but if you don't have an independent bookstore, of course, there is always Amazon. Um, and anyway, I hope you can stop by on my book tour sometime.
Well, and your events are on your website, right?
My events are on my website, www.andrewlawler.com. And I'll be out west as well for those viewers who are on the West Coast. And then I'll be up north in the next few days. So I really want to try and get a conversation going about the story of Roanoke, because I think it has a lot to tell us about not just the past, as I said, but also about today.
So one more. This is a big question, but maybe you can give it to us in a minute or two answer. So Chris wants to know, can you share your thoughts on the American Horror Stories episode on the Lost Colony?
Well, I did watch it, and I actually tried to interview Ryan Murphy, who is the producer, who did Glee, of course, as well. And unfortunately, he wouldn't talk to me, but I was interested because what was so interesting about that story is, of course, the power of Roanoke in pop culture is so strong. There's so many stories like that. There's lots of vampire stories that take place on Roanoke as well. But what I found particularly interesting about American Horror Story is that the main characters are a mixed race couple who are being threatened by John White's wife, who of course never was actually in the New World. But I thought that was a really interesting choice, that somehow intuitively Ryan Murphy seemed to know that this is a story that deals with race. And so I hope someday to be able to have a conversation with him about that.
Well, it'll be interesting to follow your work, Andrew, and see what else you discover with this, because I have an inkling that you're going to be, finding something out that's going to solidify some of this even more. So,
well, I will be keeping my eyes out. We have a National Geographic story online now, in the June issue, and also online, and also about the Dare Stones. We didn't even get to talk about that. We could do that some other time.
Yeah, I would love to.
Yeah,
I'd love to have you come back. There's so much more to delve into, and it's. I mean, this is a big book. It's a lot to tell. This story, isn't it? And I'm also curious.
I had to follow every lead. It wasn't worth doing unless you follow every lead.
So when you get this book, my dear audience, you're going to know that you're reading something authentic, because he followed every lead and he did not leave a rock unturned. And if there was a clue, he explored it right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So a lot of fun and interest in this book. So I highly suggest you all get it and reach out to Andrew. I'm going to show you my book that's on Amazon now, in Just One Afternoon, Listening to Hearts of Men. And very, very soon, maybe in the next day or so, might even have its sister there, called In Just One Afternoon, Listening to the Hearts of Twins. So I will keep you informed about that. So Andrew, final words of wisdom from you, final words of something about this work.
Well, I think that this is really a story about the power of myth. It's a story about how we tell stories that give us identity, that tell us who we are. And I think Roanoke is a story that's been kind of relegated to pop culture mystery, but it's so much more. It's really our creation story. Right. So I really encourage people to learn about it, because that's what it can tell us, who we are and where we came from.
So, see, I'm really into stories. I love people's stories. That's what a lot of my work obviously is all about, that. And I usually do a lot more interrupting when I'm doing my interviews. But today I have to tell you, I just wanted you to rock and roll, because there's nothing to interrupt. You have to hear the story. Right.
Right.
So I'm glad.
Well, thank you.
Go ahead.
It's been really a lot of fun, and I appreciate you. It's not good to let a journalist talk, because normally we're listening. So I hope that you had a chance to get a word in edgewise.
Well, I got in my words when I wanted to, but I think, the story is much more powerful than anybody hearing me today. So I want to thank you for that. And I want to thank everybody out here for listening, watching, being here with us today and absorbing all of this. It's fun. And I would love to hear from you anytime. Marilyn at marilynshannon.com. Please reach out to me, and I look forward to seeing you the next time. Bye-bye.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.